She stood on his arm, a diamond trophy at the most exclusive gala of the year. The whispers from New York's elite called her the victor, the young, ambitious mistress who had finally dethroned the forgotten wife. Her billionaire lover, Richard Vance, was moments away from a speech that would implicitly announce her as the new face of his empire, sealing their triumph in a blaze of camera flashes. They believed they had rewritten the story, that the night the future was theirs. But they forgot one crucial detail. The woman they had cast aside wasn't just the wife. She was the architect, and she was about to make her entrance. The air in the back of the Rolls-Royce Phantom was thick with the scent of Serafina Monet's ambition, a custom blend of Tom Ford's fucking fabulous and the intoxicating aroma of imminent victory. She smoothed a perfectly manicured hand, its nails painted a shade of defiant crimson called Scorned down the silk of her J. Mendel gown. The fabric was the color of liquid gold, clinging to her meticulously sculpted body like a second skin. It was a declaration. Tonight, she was not just an accessory. She was the prize. Beside her, Richard Vance adjusted the Patek Philippe on his wrist, the subtle click of the platinum clasp, the only sound in the plush interior. He was a man carved from privilege and power, with a jawline as sharp as his business acumen and eyes the color of old money. He smiled at her, a confident, predatory smile that had once made her weak in the knees. Now, it just felt like confirmation. Nervous darling. He murmured, his voice a low baritone that had charmed countless boardrooms, and for the past 18 months, her. Serafina laughed, a sound she had practiced to be light and effervescent. Nervous Richard. I feel like I was born for this. And in a way she was. Serafina hadn't been born into the world of Park Avenue penthouses and summering in the Hamptons. She had clawed her way into it. She'd started as a junior marketing associate at Vance Innovations, a wide-eyed girl from a middle-class suburb with a hunger that the other silver-spooned interns couldn't comprehend. She saw Richard not just as the CEO, but as a gatekeeper to a different universe. She had studied him, learned his tastes, his weaknesses, his desires. His greatest weakness, she'd discovered, was his vanity. His greatest desire was to feel young and adored. His wife Eleanor had long since ceased to provide that. Serafina had only seen photos of her a woman with classic, severe beauty, perpetually dressed in tasteful but uninspired Chanel suits. The society pages called her the reclusive Mrs. Vance, a ghost who haunted the background of her husband's empire. Richard spoke of her with a mixture of pity and annoyance, a business arrangement that had grown stale. She's comfortable, he'd say the word, dripping with disdain. She doesn't understand the drive, the fire. Serafina was all fire. The car glided to a stop before the grand entrance of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Vance Foundation annual charity gala was the crown jewel of the New York social calendar, a night where titans of industry paid exorbitant sums to dine amongst ancient artifacts, all under the guise of philanthropy. Tonight it was to be her coronation. For weeks, the gossip columns fueled by anonymous tips from Serafina's own burner phone had been buzzing. Richard Vance was set to formally separate from his wife, and his stunning new partner was about to be officially revealed. The flashbulbs were blinding as the door was opened by a uniformed attendant. Richard stepped out first, a king surveying his domain. Then he turned and offered his hand to Serafina. She took it, stepping onto the red carpet as a cacophony of shutters erupted. She smiled, a perfect, dazzling display of white teeth her head held high. She could feel the stares, hear the frantic whispers of the reporters. "Mr. Vance, is this your official companion for the evening?" "Serafina over here." "Who are you wearing?" She let Richard handle the press, her hand possessively tucked into the crook of his arm. Inside the great hall was a sea of glittering jewels and tailored tuxedos. A string quartet played Vivaldi from a balcony, the notes weaving through the polite chatter. Serafina's eyes scanned the room, drinking in the power, the sheer unapologetic wealth. She saw Donovan Sterling, Richard's chief rival from Sterling Enterprises, watching them with a cynical smirk. She saw socialites whose Instagram feeds she had studied like textbooks, their faces a mixture of envy and disapproval. She reveled in it all. Richard leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear. "See, this is where you belong. Not tucked away in some dusty mansion on the Upper East Side." It was a direct jab at Eleanor, and it thrilled Serafina. She squeezed his arm. "It's everything I ever dreamed of." They moved through the crowd, a vortex of power and scandal. Richard was in his element, greeting senators and hedge fund managers with practiced ease, his hand always resting proprietorially on the small of Serafina's back. He introduced her not as his girlfriend, but with a deliberate ambiguity that fueled the speculation. "This is Serafina Monet, my visionary new partner." She played her part flawlessly, discussing market trends with a tech billionaire one moment and complimenting a society doyenne on her Harry Winston necklace the next. She felt their judgment, the cold appraisal in their eyes, but she mistook it for jealousy. They were looking at the future, and she was it. Eleanor Vance was the past, a black-and-white photograph in a digital world. Later, as they stood by the Temple of Dendur, spectacularly lit within its glass-walled enclosure, Richard clinked his champagne flute against hers. To new beginnings he toasted his eyes, locking with hers. To the future, she replied, her voice husky with emotion. The future of Vance Innovations. The future of her name, Monet, linked with his. The future she had fought for, schemed for, and now finally won. She looked around the magnificent room at the powerful people who now had to acknowledge her at the man beside her who had given it all to her. The wife Eleanor was a non-entity, a footnote in a story that was now unequivocally hers. She had won. There was simply no other possible outcome. Richard Vance felt a surge of pure, unadulterated power. It was a feeling more intoxicating than the vintage Dom Perignon, flowing freely around him, more satisfying than closing a multi-billion-dollar deal. Standing with Serafina on his arm, he was not just Richard Vance, CEO. He was a force of nature, a man reborn. He glanced at Serafina, her golden dress shimmering under the carefully curated museum lighting. She was exquisite, a perfect symbol of his success. Young, sharp, beautiful, and utterly devoted to him. She looked at him with an awe that Eleanor hadn't shown in over a decade. Eleanor looked at him with the cool, appraising gaze of a business partner, a silent accountant tallying his flaws. He hated that look. He hated the quiet way she could dissect his most ambitious plans with a single logical question. He hated that her family's money, the initial seed that had started it all, was a silent, unspoken fact that hung between them. He'd taken that paltry sum and built an empire, his empire. He had done the work, taken the risks, schmoozed the investors. She had merely existed a silent partner in a life she no longer seemed interested in living with any passion. Tonight was a declaration of independence. By bringing Serafina here to his gala, he was making a statement to the world, and more importantly, to Eleanor. He was done playing the part of the dutiful husband. The Vance name was his, the company was his, and he would have a woman on his arm who reflected his own brilliance, not the staid old money legacy of his wife's family. Richard Darling. Donovan. Sterling is staring daggers at us. Serafina whispered, pressing closer to him. Richard followed her gaze and saw his rival standing near a Roman bust, a scotch in his hand, and a sardonic smile on his lips. "Let him stare," Richard said, with a dismissive wave. "He's a dinosaur. His company is built on old tech. We're the future." He believed it. Vance Innovations was soaring thanks to a series of aggressive acquisitions and the launch of their new Prometheus AI platform. It was his vision, his genius. He had steered the ship, and now he was reaping the rewards. As the gala's host, he was scheduled to give the keynote address after dinner. He had tweaked the speech himself that afternoon, adding subtle lines that to the discerning ear would signal the changing of the guard. He would speak of new eras of shedding the past to embrace a bold future, and of the inspiration that drives a man to reach new heights. He would gesture vaguely in Serafina's direction as he said it, and the gossip columns would have their headline for the morning. He guided Serafina towards their table front and center, a small plaque reading "Reserved for Mr. Richard Vance." He made a point of pulling out her chair himself, a public display of chivalry that was both for her and for the hundreds of pairs of eyes watching them. The dinner was a blur of bland poached salmon and meaningful conversations. He networked, he charmed, he held court. All the while he was acutely aware of Serafina beside him, her presence a constant, thrilling validation. He felt a pang of guilt, but it was shallow, easily dismissed. Eleanor had chosen this. She had chosen her charities, her quiet lunches at the Carlisle, her predictable, passionless existence. She had checked out of their marriage years ago, leaving him no choice but to seek life elsewhere. This was a consequence of her own coldness, not his infidelity. Or so he told himself. When the time came, the Foundation's chairman, a portly man named Arthur Hemmings, walked to the stage. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the man whose vision and generosity make all of this possible. The founder and CEO of Vance Innovations. Mr. Richard Vance. Applause, polite but enthusiastic, filled the hall. Richard stood buttoning his custom Brioni tuxedo jacket. He gave Serafina's hand a squeeze under the table, a silent promise. "Wish me luck," he whispered. "You don't need it." She breathed, her eyes shining with adoration. He walked on to the stage, the bright lights warming his face. He felt invincible. He gripped the sides of the lectern, looking out over the faces of New York's most powerful people. They were all here, hanging on his every word. He was the king of this castle. He began his speech, his voice resonant and confident. He spoke of the Foundation's work of innovation, of the future. He was halfway through a well-rehearsed anecdote about a recent trip to the Tokyo office when he saw it. A subtle shift in the room, a ripple of whispers, starting from the back near the grand entrance. Heads were turning not towards him, but away from him. The focused attention of the room was fracturing, dissipating. A flash of irritation crossed his face. He was losing his audience. What could possibly be more important than him? He followed their gaze. A figure had appeared at the main archway, silhouetted for a moment against the light of the great hall. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. His confident flow faltered. He trailed off mid-sentence, his mouth suddenly dry. The figure stepped into the light. It was a woman. She wasn't wearing a glittering gown. She was wearing a perfectly tailored midnight blue Armani pantsuit that screamed power, not prettiness. Her silver blonde hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon, and on her lapel was a simple diamond brooch he hadn't seen in years. It was the first piece of jewelry he had ever given her. It was Eleanor. His heart hammered against his ribs. She wasn't supposed to be here. She never came to these things anymore. She hated the publicity, the glad-handing. Her presence was a violation of their unspoken rules. He looked from her cold, calm face to Serafina at the table, whose own expression of triumph had frozen into a mask of disbelief and horror. The king suddenly felt his throne, a grand, solid thing, just moments before, begin to tremble beneath him. The sudden appearance of Eleanor Vance did not just ripple through the room. It fractured the carefully constructed reality of the evening. The polite veneer of high society, usually so resilient, cracked under the weight of her silent, unexpected arrival. The string quartet, sensing the seismic shift in atmosphere, faltered for a moment. A single violin, screeching a discordant note before they hastily resumed playing. But it was too late. The spell was broken. Donovan Sterling, who had been observing Richard's preening performance with the detached amusement of a seasoned predator, leaned back in his chair and took a slow sip of his Macallan 25. He'd known Richard for 2 decades, had competed against him, and despised his flashy, substanceless approach to business. He had watched Richard parade his young mistress around all evening with a sense of grim satisfaction, knowing that such hubris always eventually meets its comeuppance. He just hadn't expected it to be so swift and so beautifully dramatic. "Well, well," he murmured to the investment banker, sitting next to him. The ghost of banquets passed. The banker, a man named Gerald, squinted towards the entrance. "My God, is that Eleanor? I haven't seen her out in years. What is she wearing?" "A pantsuit to the Met Gala." "She's not here for the fashion," Gerald Donovan said, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "She's here for business." At a nearby table, Beatrice Caldwell, a society columnist for a high-end magazine, whose pen could make or break a reputation, was already dictating a frantic message into her phone. "Eleanor Vance has just arrived. Repeat the Eleanor Vance. She looks formidable. This is no longer a simple society scandal. This is a declaration of war. Get a photographer to the entrance now. Forget the B-list celebrities on the steps." The whispers were now a low, persistent hum, the sound of 100 private conversations happening at once. "Look at Serafina's face. She looks like she's seen a ghost. Poor girl. She actually thought she had him. Don't feel too sorry for her. She knew what she was getting into. But to do this here in front of everyone, it's magnificent and utterly brutal. Richard looks like he's about to have an aneurysm on stage." They were right. On the brightly lit stage, Richard Vance was frozen. His speech, his confident posture, his carefully crafted persona all had evaporated. He looked like a man who had been caught not just with his hand in the cookie jar, but attempting to steal the entire jar factory. His eyes darted between Eleanor, a vision of icy composure, walking slowly, deliberately into the room, and Serafina, whose face had gone pale beneath her expensive makeup. The golden J. Mendel gown that had seemed so triumphant moments before now looked garish, the costume of a failed usurper. Serafina herself was trapped in a nightmare. Her mind raced. This wasn't possible. Eleanor was supposed to be at home cataloguing her porcelain collection, or whatever it was she did. She was the past a relic. Yet here she was in the flesh, commanding more attention with her silent stride, than Serafina had with her meticulously planned grand entrance. Every step Eleanor took was a nail in the coffin of Serafina's dreams. The stairs that had felt like envy just minutes ago now felt like pure, unadulterated pity. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Eleanor did not look at her husband. She did not look at his mistress. Her gaze was fixed forward, sweeping across the room with a calm authority that was unnerving. She greeted no one yet. Everyone felt her presence. The crowd instinctively parted before her, creating a clear path toward the stage. She walked not with anger, but with the unhurried purpose of someone who owned the very ground she was walking on. Arthur Hemmings, the foundation chairman, bustled forward, his face a mask of confusion and panic. "Eleanor, my dear, what a surprise. We weren't expecting you." Eleanor paused and gave him a small, cool smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm a patron of the arts, Arthur, and I'm still a board member of this foundation. I believe my invitation was simply misplaced. No matter. I'm here now." Her voice was calm, cultured, and carried clearly in the suddenly hushed room. It held no hint of hysteria or tremor of a woman scorned. It was the voice of a CEO about to address her board, and it sent a collective chill through the audience. Richard, still paralyzed on stage, watched her approach. He felt a primal fear he hadn't experienced since he was a young man desperate for his first round of funding. He saw her pass Donovan Sterling's table and saw his rival raise his glass to her in a silent, respectful toast. The gesture was not lost on him. Alliances were shifting, opinions were cementing, and he was on the wrong side of it. He tried to regain control to somehow salvage the situation. He cleared his throat, tapping the microphone. "Well, an unexpected guest, as I was saying." But no one was listening to him anymore. All eyes were on Eleanor as she reached the small set of stairs leading to the stage. She paused at the bottom, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. Her expression was completely unreadable, a placid ocean concealing untold depths. And then, with a grace that was both terrifying and beautiful, she began to ascend. Time seemed to slow as Eleanor Vance placed a hand on the polished brass railing and began to climb the 4 short steps to the stage. Each step was a quiet thunderclap in the cavernous room. The clink of her simple Manolo Blahnik heels on the wood was the only sound the string quartet, having finally given up all pretense of playing their bows, hovering motionlessly over their instruments. The clatter of silverware ceased. The whispers died. A profound anticipatory silence descended thick and heavy as velvet. Eleanor moved with an economy of motion that belied the turmoil raging beneath the surface. For 2 days, she had existed on little more than black coffee and a cold, burning rage. Her lawyer, Alistair Finnich, a man who had served her family for 40 years, had advised a quieter, more private approach. "We file the papers, Eleanor. We let the lawyers handle it. A public scene will only tarnish the Vance name," he'd cautioned in his dusty wood-panelled office. "Richard has already tarnished the Vance name," she had, replied, her voice dangerously low. "My name. He has done it publicly with relish. The response must also be public." Alistair, seeing the flint in her eyes, the same flint he'd seen in her father's when he'd built his initial fortune, had simply nodded and said, "Very well. What do you need from me?" Now, as she reached the stage, she felt not fear but a strange, liberating clarity. She had spent 20 years as the silent partner, the quiet force behind the throne, allowing Richard to be the face of their shared success because he craved the spotlight and she craved results. She had managed the family trusts, overseen the philanthropic endeavors, and provided the stable foundational wealth that allowed Richard the freedom to take his celebrated risks. She had tolerated his ego, his occasional indiscretions, mistaking them for the trivial eccentricities of a powerful man. But this public coronation of a cheap, ambitious subordinate was not an indiscretion. It was an erasure. He was trying to erase her from her own life's work. Richard, finally jolted from his paralysis by her proximity, took a step back from the lectern. A sheen of sweat was visible on his forehead under the hot stage lights. "Eleanor!" He hissed, his voice a hoarse whisper that the microphone thankfully didn't catch. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" "This is my night." Eleanor didn't answer him. She walked past him, giving him a wide berth, as if he were a piece of contaminated furniture. She approached the lectern, her posture perfect, her expression serene. The audience held its collective breath. They were expecting a scene, a screaming match, a thrown drink, the usual messy drama of the rich and betrayed. She calmly adjusted the microphone, lowering it slightly to fit her height. The small movement was so deliberate, so devoid of panic, that it was more shocking than any outburst could have been. She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze sweeping over them, acknowledging them, taking command. Her eyes briefly met Serafina's. The younger woman flinched, as if struck. In that single fleeting glance, Serafina saw not the fury of a rival, but something far worse, utter insignificance. It was the look one might give a fly buzzing near a banquet table, an annoyance to be dealt with swiftly and forgotten. In that moment, Serafina Monet understood that she had never been a player in this game. She had only ever been a pawn, and she was about to be sacrificed. Eleanor then looked at Richard, who was hovering uselessly behind her, his face a mottled canvas of fury and fear. Her expression remained unchanged, but a flicker of something pity, perhaps, or a final weary contempt passed through her eyes. He had been her husband, the man she had once loved, the father of her children. Now he was just a liability, a problem to be managed. Finally, she turned her full attention to the audience. She rested her hands lightly on the sides of the lectern, her fingers steady. She took a soft, even breath. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the museum's climate control system was audible. "Good evening," she began, her voice, perfectly modulated, calm and clear, amplified by the sound system to fill every corner of the vast space. "I apologize for the interruption. My husband appears to have lost his place in his speech." A few nervous titters broke the silence. The line was delivered with such dry surgical precision that it was both a wifely excuse and a devastating critique. Richard's face darkened with humiliation. He has a habit of getting carried away. Eleanor continued, her voice still smooth as silk. "Especially when it comes to telling stories. He's always been a wonderful storyteller. But I find, as one gets older, that facts become so much more important than fiction." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. The hook was set. The entire gala, from the senators to the socialites, leaned in. They were no longer spectators at a charity dinner. They were the audience at a public execution, and the executioner was a woman in an Armani pantsuit. My husband, Eleanor, continued, her voice, unwavering, spoke tonight of a bold, new future for Vance Innovations. He spoke of new vision, new inspiration, and on that, we are in complete agreement. The company is indeed entering a new era. What he failed to mention, however, are the precise mechanics of that transition. She paused, taking a deliberate sip from the glass of water Richard had left at the lectern. The simple act was one of supreme confidence, a moment of punctuation that held 1,000 people in rapt attention. Richard, standing behind her, looked like a man searching for an exit on a sinking ship. He opened his mouth to intervene, to say something, but no words came out. He was powerless. The stage was his, but the night was hers. Most of you know me as Eleanor Vance, Richard's wife. She set her eyes, scanning the faces of people she had known for decades. The quiet one, the one who chairs the library committee and hosts the occasional charity luncheon. This was a narrative that for a long time was convenient. It allowed my husband to be the public face of our endeavors, while I managed the less glamorous but far more critical foundational aspects of our wealth. A murmur went through the room. This was not the speech of a scorned woman. This was the speech of a chairman of the board. When my father George DeWitt passed away, Eleanor's voice took on a sharper, more clinical tone. He left his entire estate, including his portfolio of groundbreaking semiconductor patents, in a trust. The Eleanor DeWitt Grantor Trust, to be exact. It was that trust, and only that trust, that provided the seed capital, the intellectual property, and the collateral for the first 5 years of the company that would become Vance Innovations. Donovan Sterling sat bolt upright in his chair, the Scotch forgotten. He, like everyone else, had assumed Richard had built the company from the ground up, a classic self-made man narrative. The truth was so much more complex and so much more devastating. The legal structure is quite simple for those of you in finance. Eleanor went on, a hint of steel entering her voice. The trust is the majority shareholder of Vance Innovations, holding 62% of all voting stock. I am the sole trustee and sole beneficiary of that trust. My husband was granted the position of CEO and chairman as part of a management agreement, an agreement contingent upon his acting in the best financial interests of the trust, of my interests. The silence in the room was now absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every person present was furiously recalculating their understanding of Richard Vance. The king was a regent. The emperor had no clothes. For the last 18 months, Eleanor said, her gaze finally briefly flicking towards Seraphina, who looked as if she might physically faint. Mr. Vance has engaged in behavior that can only be described as reckless. He has used corporate funds for personal extravagance that goes far beyond the bounds of his compensation package. He has leveraged company assets to secure personal loans for non-business-related ventures. She let the euphemism hang in the air, a poisoned dart, and his recent attempts to install a demonstrably unqualified individual. Her eyes were now locked on Seraphina, cold and unforgiving, into a senior strategic role without board approval constitutes a flagrant breach of his fiduciary duty. Seraphina felt 1,000 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare. It was true. Richard had promised her a newly created Chief Strategy Officer position, a title that would have cemented her position and given her a 7-figure salary. It had felt like the ultimate prize. Now it was just another exhibit in her public humiliation. Therefore, Eleanor announced, her voice ringing with finality. As of 9 o'clock this evening, an emergency injunction was filed with the New York State Supreme Court and delivered to the board. Pursuant to Section 7B of the Management Agreement, the morality clause, for those who appreciate a touch of irony, I have exercised my right as sole trustee to terminate Richard Vance's management contract for cause effective immediately. A collective gasp swept the room. It was an audible shockwave. He is hereby removed as CEO and chairman of the board of Vance Innovations, Eleanor declared. Richard staggered back a step, his face ashen. He looked not at Eleanor, but at the stunned faces of his peers, his friends, his rivals. He saw no sympathy. He saw only the cold, hard calculus of a power shift. He was no longer one of them. Furthermore, Eleanor wasn't finished. She was twisting the knife. The board was convened via emergency conference call 2 hours ago. They have unanimously voted to install an interim CEO to oversee operations while a permanent replacement is found. As the majority shareholder, I will be assuming the role of executive chairwoman to guide the company through this transition. She looked directly at Richard, and for the first time, a sliver of emotion showed on her face, a profound glacial disappointment. Richard, your personal effects will be packed and sent to your club. The locks on the townhouse have been changed. The corporate accounts have been frozen. A severance package, one far more generous than you deserve, has been drafted by my lawyer. I suggest you sign it. She then looked back at the audience. I apologize for bringing business to a charity event. But when an infection is found, it must be cut out swiftly and cleanly before it poisons the entire organism. Vance Innovations is a strong company. It was built on a solid foundation, and it will have a bold, new, and transparent future. Thank you. With that, she stepped back from the lectern. She had not raised her voice. She had not cried. She had simply and methodically, with the precision of a surgeon, dismantled a man's life and empire in under 5 minutes. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the frantic, almost silent clicking of Beatrice Caldwell's thumbs on her phone's screen. Her face illuminated by its glow as she typed the story that would shatter the internet by midnight. The guests were frozen, trapped between the thrill of witnessing such a monumental implosion and the social awkwardness of its immediate aftermath. Then the dam broke. The photographers who had been held at the edges of the room surged forward, their flashes erupting in a blinding, strobing frenzy. They ignored Eleanor, who was now being discreetly flanked by 2 stern-looking men in dark suits she had hired for the occasion. Their lenses were aimed squarely at the 2 figures left stranded on the stage, the deposed king and his would-be queen. Richard Vance stood as if turned to stone, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief. The world he had built, the identity he had so carefully curated, had been obliterated. He was no longer Richard Vance, the visionary CEO. He was just a man in an expensive suit who had been fired by his wife in front of everyone he knew. He saw his rival, Donovan Sterling, slowly get to his feet and begin a slow, deliberate clap. It was an applause of one, but it was deafening in its mockery. Soon a few others, those who had long harbored resentment for Richard's arrogance, joined in. It was not an ovation, it was a verdict. Seraphina's world had shrunk to the size of the tabletop in front of her. The stares, the flashes, the pitying and scornful looks, they were physical blows. Her golden dress felt like a clown costume. The diamond necklace Richard had given her, the one she'd flaunted on Instagram just hours before, with the caption, "The future is bright," felt like a lead weight around her neck. She pushed her chair back, a desperate animal instinct to flee kicking in. She had to get out. She stumbled to her feet, her stilettos catching on the thick carpet. She didn't look at Richard. He was no longer her ticket to the stars. He was the anchor dragging her to the bottom of the ocean. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but there was none. She was the center of a storm of her own making. Eleanor, meanwhile, descended the stage with the same calm purpose with which she had ascended. Her lawyer, Mr. Alistair Finch, materialized at her side, a folder tucked under his arm. He had been waiting discreetly by the exit as planned. Flawlessly executed, Eleanor, he murmured, his voice filled with pride. It was necessary, Alistair, she replied, her voice low. She felt no triumph, only a grim sense of finality. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a clean-up operation. As she walked through the parted crowd, people who had barely acknowledged her for years were now clamoring for her attention. Eleanor, magnificent. My dear, if there's anything I can do, we should have lunch. My office will call yours. She gave them all the same small, non-committal smile, her eyes already focused on the future. She was no longer just a wife or a socialite. She was the power in the room, and they were all realigning themselves to the new center of gravity. Her gaze met Donovan Sterling's. He approached her, his earlier smirk replaced by a look of genuine respect. Eleanor, he said, his voice a low rumble. That was the most impressive corporate takeover I have ever witnessed, and I've seen my share. It wasn't a takeover, Donovan, she corrected him coolly. It was a restoration of order. He nodded, accepting the correction. If you need a friendly vote on the board, or an ally in this city, you have my number. Thank you, Donovan. I'll remember that, she said, and then she continued her steady, unhurried exit. Back on the stage, reality finally crashed down on Richard. He stumbled towards the lectern, grabbing it for support. He looked out at the chaos, at his legacy turning to ash. He saw Serafina, her face streaked with tears, pushing her way through the gawking crowd towards a side exit, a pariah fleeing the scene of her own downfall. She was gone. The dream was over. He felt a burning, helpless rage. He opened his mouth, perhaps to yell, to protest, to say something, anything to reclaim a shred of his dignity. But a security guard, one of the men Eleanor had hired, stepped onto the stage. He was large, impassive, and stood just a little too close. Mr. Vance, the guard, said, his voice polite but firm. I think it's time to go. The public humiliation was complete. Escorted by a guard like a common trespasser, Richard Vance was led off the stage and out of the room, the sound of camera shutters following him like a volley of gunfire. The gala was over. The rain had ended. 2 weeks later, the corner office on the 54th floor of the Vance Innovations building, now officially rebranded as DeWitt Technologies, was unrecognizable. The dark mahogany, the overstuffed leather chairs, and the mounted sailfish from one of Richard's ludicrous fishing trips were all gone. In their place were clean lines, modern art, and a large glass desk that was almost completely clear, save for a laptop and a single perfect white orchid. Eleanor stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the controlled chaos of Fifth Avenue. She wasn't wearing a power suit today, but a simple, elegant cashmere dress in a deep shade of cobalt blue. She felt lighter. The weight of 20 years of propping up a fragile male ego had been lifted, and in its place was the energizing burden of genuine responsibility. Her first week as executive chairwoman had been a whirlwind. She had personally addressed the entire company via a town hall, assuring them of stability and a new direction focused on sustainable innovation rather than Richard's reckless headline-grabbing acquisitions. She had promoted a brilliant, overlooked female engineer to chief technology officer and had begun the process of untangling the financial mess Richard had left behind. The markets, after an initial shock, had responded favorably. The stock, now under the DeWitt name, had rallied. The story of the quiet wife who was secretly the genius founder was a narrative investors could get behind. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her daughter, a graduate student at Stanford, saw the Forbes article. The matriarch of Manhattan. You're officially a legend, Mom. So proud of you. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. That more than anything was what this was for. To reclaim not just her company, but her own story for herself and for her children. The fates of the other two players in the drama had unspooled just as publicly. Richard, after a week of hiding at his golf club, had attempted a public relations offensive, giving a disastrous interview where he portrayed himself as the victim of a vindictive, power-hungry wife. It backfired spectacularly. He became a laughingstock, a meme, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the country. Stripped of his corporate power and social standing, he was a hollow man rattling around in a world that no longer had a place for him. His lawyers were now fighting for the scraps of the generous severance package Eleanor had offered. Serafina's fall had been even more precipitous. Her influencer career, built on an image of aspirational luxury and access, evaporated overnight. Brands dropped her. Her followers, who had once envied her, now mocked her relentlessly in the comments section. The usurper, they called her, the face of failure. She had deactivated her accounts, sold the jewelry Richard had given her to pay her rent, and disappeared from the public eye. Her 15 minutes of fame had ended in a lifetime of infamy. She had gambled everything on a king, only to discover he was a jester. Eleanor felt a fleeting pang of something akin to pity for them both. They were casualties of their own greed and arrogance. But she did not dwell on it. She was looking forward, not back. Her assistant buzzed on the intercom. "Miss Vance, Mr. Sterling, is on the line for you." Eleanor walked over to her desk and picked up the phone. Donovan. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Eleanor?" His voice boomed through the receiver. "I just saw your latest quarterly projection. It's aggressive. I love it. I think it's time we talked about that merger my people proposed a few years back." The one Richard laughed out of the room. Eleanor gazed out the window again at the spires of the city stretching out before her. A new landscape of possibilities. "I'm listening," she said, a hint of a smile in her voice. "But let's be clear, Donovan. It wouldn't be a merger. It would be an acquisition." She was no longer the silent partner, the reclusive wife, the ghost in the machine. She was Eleanor DeWitt Vance, the woman who had built an empire, lost it, and in one spectacular night took it all back. And she was just getting started. 3 months after the gala, a season had turned. The crisp autumn air that had greeted Eleanor's revolution had given way to the biting chill of a New York winter. Snow dusted the gargoyles of the DeWitt Technologies building, but inside Eleanor's office, the atmosphere was one of focused, productive warmth. Her leadership had not just stabilized the company, it had invigorated it. Morale was at an all-time high, and a new project born from the very patents her father had created was already showing promise that dwarfed anything Richard had achieved in his final years. But victory, she was learning, had its own complex emotional architecture. It was not a single triumphant peak, but a new landscape to be navigated, complete with its own ghosts. Today she was confronting them directly. She stood not in her sleek, modern office, but in the echoing marble foyer of the Upper East Side townhouse she had once called home. The air was cold, the heating turned down to a skeletal minimum. Most of the furniture was gone, either sold or sent to her new, more contemporary apartment overlooking Central Park. All that remained were a few pieces shrouded in white dust covers, looking like silent, sorrowful spectres. She was here for a final walkthrough before the property was listed, a final severing of ties. She walked into the grand library, a room where she had spent countless lonely evenings while Richard was working late. The shelves once lined with his collection of unread leather-bound classics were now bare. She ran a hand along the dusty wood of his former desk. The very desk where he had likely taken Seraphina's calls, where he had planned his new life while living in the shell of their old one. She felt no anger, only a profound sense of distance, as if observing the artifacts of a stranger's life. He had been a man who loved the props of power more than the substance of it. This empty room was a perfect monument to him. Her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. An unknown number. She almost ignored it, but a strange intuition made her answer. "Hello." The voice on the other end was a ghost itself, thinner, raspier, stripped of its confident baritone. "Ellie Richard." She straightened her spine, her hand falling away from the desk. "There is nothing for us to discuss, Richard. Communicate through your lawyer." "Please," he begged, and the sound was so alien, so pathetic, it was jarring. Just 5 minutes. I'm at the club. They're talking about revoking my membership, my own goddamn club. That is a consequence of your actions," she said, her voice as cold and empty as the room around her. "I know, God, I know. I was an idiot, a blind, arrogant fool. I see that now." He paused, and she could hear the shakiness of his breath. I find myself thinking about that trip we took to Lake Como after we first got the funding. Before everything. Remember that little restaurant, Ellie? Remember how we felt? We were a team. We were going to conquer the world. It was a classic manipulation, an appeal to a past he had systematically dismantled. A year ago it might have worked. It might have found a crack in her resolve. But she was no longer that woman. The foundation had been tested, and the cracks had been filled with steel. I remember a young woman who believed in her husband. She said, her voice quiet but unyielding. And I remember a man who took that belief and used it as a ladder, kicking away the rungs as he climbed. The past you're remembering is a fiction you wrote, Richard. I am living in the present. Goodbye. She ended the call before he could respond, blocking the number immediately. She felt a tremor in her hand, the last echo of a 20-year connection finally being severed. It was not triumph. It was just closure. A necessary, painful amputation. Later that afternoon, her son Arthur met her at the townhouse. At 22, he had his father's height, but her thoughtful, steady eyes. He'd been studying abroad during the gala, and had returned to a family landscape utterly transformed. He walked through the empty rooms, his hands in his pockets. "It's weird seeing it like this," he said, his voice low. "Like a museum, after all the exhibits have been taken away. It's just a house, Arthur," she said gently. He stopped in front of the grand staircase. "I saw him last week. Dad. I met him for coffee." Eleanor weighted her expression carefully neutral. "He looks old," Arthur continued, struggling with the words. "Beaten. He kept talking about his legacy, about how you had stolen it. I told him he was the one who threw it away. He didn't like that." Arthur finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a sad maturity. Was this the only way, Mom, to do it so? Publicly? It was the question she had asked herself in the dark hours of the night. She owed her son the truth. Your father was planning to install that woman on the board. She explained, her voice even. He was going to leverage company assets to give her a title and a payout that would have been a golden parachute for life, all at the expense of the company you and your sister will one day inherit. He was poisoning the well, Arthur. Not just our marriage, but the very foundation of this family's legacy, your grandfather's legacy. A private divorce would have been a quiet negotiation. He would have walked away with a fortune and a story that he had simply moved on. The truth would have been buried. Sometimes the only way to treat a sickness is to expose it to the light. It was brutal, yes, but it was also the only way to truly save the company, to save our legacy. Arthur nodded slowly, processing it all. He built it, though. Didn't he? He was the face of it, Eleanor corrected softly. But a face is nothing without the heart and brain that make it work. The heart of that company was your grandfather's genius, and the brain was the strategy I helped manage from this very house. Your father was the salesman, a brilliant one for a time, but he forgot what he was selling. She put a hand on his arm. This was never about revenge. It was about restoration. Now DeWitt Technologies is secure. Its future and yours is secure. That is a legacy worth fighting for. He looked at her truly, looked at her not just as his mother, but as the formidable woman she had become. A slow smile spread across his face. The matriarch of Manhattan, he said, echoing his sister's text. I like it. Leaving the townhouse a final time, Eleanor locked the heavy oak doors herself. The decisive click of the deadbolt echoed in the empty street. She walked past the spot where Richard's Rolls-Royce used to wait for him and got into the driver's seat of her own car, a sleek electric Porsche Taycan, silent and powerful. As she pulled away from the curb, she didn't look back. The past was a house of empty rooms. The future was a city of soaring towers waiting for her. And for the first time in a very long time, she was the one behind the wheel. Eleanor Vance's story isn't just about revenge. It's a masterclass in power strategy and the profound strength of knowing your own worth. She proved that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding all the cards, waiting for the perfect moment to play a winning hand. While Richard and Serafina chased the spotlight, she owned the entire stage. What did you think of her final move? Was it pure genius or cold-hearted justice served on a silver platter? Could Richard have ever seen it coming? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you love stories of epic comebacks and watching empires shift in a single night, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see a true power play, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable tales. Click that notification bell so you never miss a moment of the drama.